Oftentimes we see problem behaviors either in ourselves or in others, and we wish that we knew how to make those changes. We know what needs to be changed, but we just have no idea how to start making those changes, how to affect positive changes in either ourselves or another individual, and we're stuck wanting to change but not knowing how. And if you have ever found yourself in that boat, then this is the video for you, because I'm Dr. Igor Yurichevich, and this is behavior modification. Let's go. All right, so today is going to be all about how to start identifying how to make changes in target behaviors that we have chosen. In other words, today is all going to be about behavioral assessment. And we're going to start off with some definitions of what behavioral assessment is. And we'll start off with Wacker, Berg, Harding, and Cooper Brown. And this comes from the Handbook of Applied Behavior Analysis. And they state that the principal goal of behavioral assessment is to identify environmental variables that are related to increases or decreases in the target behavior. So that primary goal of what we're trying to do in behavioral assessment is to identify environmental variables that are related to either increases or decreases in target behavior. And let's break this definition down a little bit so we know exactly what we're dealing with. First off, we're talking about target behavior. So these are behaviors that have already been identified. We've already decided these are the behaviors that we want to change. That is, these are the behaviors we want to target. Next, we need to find ways to either increase or decrease those behaviors. That's what the behavioral change is all about. We choose some dimension of that target behavior, maybe duration, maybe intensity, and we're going to either try to increase it if it's a positive aspect or decrease it if it's a negative aspect. And then the behavioral assessment needs to identify what are the environmental variables, either the antecedent or the consequent environmental variables that are related to those increases and decreases in that target behavior. So we are looking for those environmental variables, those things that we can manipulate in order to affect that behavioral modification. All right, so the next definition that we're going to take a look at for behavioral assessment is a much more simple, straightforward definition, but it does get to the heart of behavioral assessment. And this one comes from Linehan in 1977 in the New Directions in Clinical Psychology. And she says that the purpose of behavioral assessment is to figure out what the client's problem is and how to change it for the better. So we need to figure out what is the problem that this client is facing, what is that target behavior, and how is it being maintained. That is the client's problem, the target behavior and the maintenance of that target behavior. And we need to identify those variables that are influencing it, that are maintaining it, and affect those, change them for the betterment of the client. So keep those two definitions in mind. We're going to keep the more formalized one up as we work through this look at behavioral assessment. And before we get into the nitty-gritty of behavioral assessment, just understand that behavioral assessment is part of a four-phase system of systematic behavioral change. So it is the beginning of a four-phase system that includes multiple steps in order to create behavioral change in a client. So assessment is actually the first one. So if you had an individual that was very argumentative, if you had an individual that didn't have good communication and social skills, well, then one thing that you can do is you can begin with an assessment to identify those environmental variables that increase this behavior, and then also try to identify variables that will decrease this target behavior, this argumentative, lack of communication skills, lack of social skills type of behavior. Once you have done that assessment, and we'll talk about how we're going to do that today, but once you do that assessment, it's just part one. It's just part one in this treatment plan. The next session or the next phase is actually planning. So this is where you come up with an intervention plan. This is where you come up with tactics and strategies that are going to be used to manipulate those environmental variables so that we can, in this case, decrease that problematic target behavior. That planning is followed up by implementation. And this is where we actually put those consequences, those strategies, those tactics into practice. And then, very importantly, that is followed up by the fourth phase, which is evaluation. And evaluation, you typically don't do it in this manner, but basically evaluation is when you take a look at the outcomes of your behavioral change program and make any changes as required. See what has been functional in changing behavior, see what has not been functional, what has been implemented well, what has not been implemented well, and then make changes as required. And that beginning part of it is the assessment. So the first step into behavioral change is assessing the target behavior, determining what increases or decreases it, what are those environmental variables, and how are they related to those increases and decreases. And these assessments can be broken down into two major categories, and that is direct or indirect assessments. Now, today we're going to focus on indirect assessments. However, if you do need an overview of direct versus indirect assessments and a little bit on direct assessment as well, there is a video. I do have a video available where we talk about that, and I'll put the link in the description so you can check that out if you need a refresher on that idea. But today we're going to focus simply on indirect assessments and the pros and cons and what it's good for and what it needs to be supplemented with. So if you need an overview of direct versus indirect and what direct assessment is, feel free to check out that video. Otherwise, we're going to focus here today on indirect assessments. So off we go. All right, so an indirect assessment. Indirect assessments are where you assess the target behavior without actually directly observing the target behavior. So hence the term indirect. You're not actually seeing the actual target behavior. You are indirectly observing correlates, things that are associated with that target behavior, outcomes of that target behavior. This is where the indirect part of that assessment comes. And indirect assessments come in two formats. These are open-ended and close-ended formats. And we'll take a look at open-ended first. So open-ended formats are formats where you allow the informant to basically comment freely without restriction on the answers that they're talking about, without restriction on things that they might bring up, without limiting them to talking just about the number, the rate, the intensity, the duration of the target behavior, without restricting them to specific stimuli and conditions. You just let them talk openly. So in this situation here, where you had an argumentative individual and his significant other is feeling the effects of that negative target behavior. So the individual in blue there, he is the client. He is the one with the very argumentative behavior that we want to decrease, the communication skills that we want to improve. So we can directly observe this behavior, for example, in a session such as this, but we can also indirectly assess this target behavior by simply conducting interviews, for example, with his significant other, and just asking him to comment on, talk about the behavior, talk about living with the individual, talk about how a conversation typically goes, and then just look for information that comes out of that that could indicate, again, those environmental variables that either increase or decrease that target behavior. So that's the open-ended format. So things like open-ended interviews are a wonderful way of doing these open-ended indirect assessments. And then the opposite of that would be the closed-end indirect assessments. And these are where you limit the individual, you limit the indirect assessment, wherever you're getting that information to certain prescribed limited answers, right? So one of the classic examples of this is the questionnaire with a Likert scale. So Likert scales are a tool that are used by a variety of different institutions and a variety of different therapists, and they limit what the informant can respond to. They limit what questions are being asked, but especially what environmental variables are being identified and what relations are being identified. So in this case, we have here a indirect assessment for child's behavior, and it asks you on a 1 to 5 scale to indicate whether or not they join in play with others. to indicate whether they are whether they comfort their peers, to indicate whether they are willing to share. And the informant would simply, in this case, probably a parent, would simply fill that out. Now, you'll notice that there's no space here if something comes to the parent and the parent all of a sudden thinks, oh my gosh, like there's this really important thing that occurs. I just noticed this really important environmental variable, like every time somebody sprays water with a garden hose, my child just loses it. If that's not on this indirect scale, there would be no way to communicate that to the therapist. So that is a closed ended assessment form. And again, notice it's indirect because we're not directly observing the target behavior, but we are still getting information on that target behavior. So we have the open-ended and we have the closed-ended form. So what are some of the pros and cons of these? They're both used in assessment. So what are some of the benefits and what are some of the drawbacks of using each of these forms of assessment? So let's start with the open-ended, something like an interview. One of the pros of this is that information about a wide range of variables may be obtained. So you're allowing the informant to simply bring up whatever variables they want to. And then you can also prompt for variables as well. You can say, well, has it ever occurred when this occurs? What is it like when this situation happens? So that allows you to get a wide range of variables, especially something that the therapist might not have thought of. Secondly, it gives you the opportunity to develop rapport with the informant and listen to their experiences. So it develops this relationship with the informant that builds a lot of trust. And this could be especially important because oftentimes the informant, if it's a significant other, if it's a parent, if it's a guardian of the client, oftentimes a lot of the intervention, a lot of the implementation of behavior change will be handed off to them eventually. So building that trust early on can go a long way towards the success of that implementation. Drawbacks and cons of the open-ended assessment techniques. Oftentimes they take longer than closed-ended indirect assessments. An open interview could take up to an hour. A closed-ended questionnaire could take you 20 minutes, right? So they oftentimes take longer. They might include a lot of information that's just not relevant. So part of the strengths of an open-ended is that information that you might not have thought of could come up from the informant, but also the informant is not a trained individual, so a lot of irrelevant stuff might come up as well. So that's a drawback. The interpretation, another drawback is that the interpretation of an open-ended interview, for example, takes a lot of analytic skill. You have to go over the transcript. You got to know what you're doing when you're analyzing this information. And it requires, because of that, a lot of clinical interviewing skills to obtain that information and develop that rapport. So you just can't jump in and conduct interviews. There's a skill to interviewing. There's a proper procedure to interviewing. There are techniques used to open and make the informant feel comfortable. And all of these require a lot of clinical training. So those are the pros and cons of open-ended. What about closed-ended assessment techniques? Well, some of the pros of these closed-ended is that they assure that some information or information about common controlling variables will come up. So there's a lot of times that there are common variables that need to be assessed. So for example, attention in children's behavior is often actually attention in anybody's behavior is often a large controlling variable. What gets attention and what does not get attention. So something like an open interview might miss that. I mean, it's not likely with a trained individual, but there is a possibility. However, with closed-ended, it's already there. It's already printed on the questionnaire. So those controlling variables, those common ones, will not be missed. A big one is that these are quick and easy to administer. So somebody without training can very easily administer an open-ended questionnaire. A closed-ended questionnaire. Somebody without training can very easily hand you a questionnaire and say, please read the instructions and fill this out. So they're quick and easy to administer. And there's very few skills that are required to administer these, but also importantly, there's very few skills required to actually interpret them as well. So oftentimes these come with a scoring key, and you simply follow the scoring key and it gives you the interpretation that comes from those questionnaires. Drawbacks to the closed-ended assessment techniques. They only ask questions about predetermined variables. So again, you can miss important variables that are important for a particular situation that might be unique. They may suggest many non-functional relationships. That is, they might suggest false positives. So somebody might never have thought of whether or not their child is willing to share. But when they see it in the questionnaire, all of a sudden they might convince themselves that, oh yeah, I don't see my child sharing. Yeah, this actually is an issue. This actually is a problem, when in reality it isn't, and it would not have come up naturally in an open-ended interview. Another con is that they can be misused by individuals, especially ones that don't have training in behavior modification. So these questionnaires can be accessed, can be given out. So for example, this one was available for free online, very easy to obtain. And if you don't have training, you can misuse these to misdiagnose individuals and misapply treatment. And then finally, there's very little opportunity to develop rapport with the informants. So there's a big difference between sitting down and having an open-ended conversation with somebody for an hour versus talking to them for 2 minutes while you hand them an questionnaire packet for them to fill out. So those are the pros and cons of closed-ended. We just went over the pros and cons of open-ended assessment techniques. So which one should you use? There's pros to both, there's cons to both. So what is the best way to use open-ended and closed-ended assessments? So for this one, we're going to go back to the Handbook of Applied Behavior Analysis, and we're going to look at what Kelly and colleagues suggest. And they suggest that you actually want to do both. So they mention that the best practice is likely to include an assessment package that contains a structured interview, at least one rating scale, direct observation, and experimental manipulation of environmental variables. Importantly for us today, they're suggesting that you have at least one structured interview. So you have one open-ended assessment session, and then you pair that with at least one rating scale, one closed-ended assessment technique. And that will give you a lot of the pros and a lot of for both sides, while minimizing the cons, because the pros of the open-ended can mitigate the cons of the closed-ended, and the pros of the closed-ended can mitigate the cons of the open-ended. So you kind of have them working together to make sure that you do what is best for your particular client. And then again, this is paired with direct observation. So I don't know if I mentioned this before, but I do have a video that covers a little bit on direct observation and how it's related to indirect observation. So if you need some more information about that, link is in the description. All right, so that is it for today. So today we took a look at what assessment is and the primary goal of behavioral assessment. We took a look at how assessment is the first part of a 4-stage model of behavior change that includes assessment as step 1, followed by planning, implementation, and then evaluation. We talked about open-ended indirect assessments and closed-ended indirect assessments and the pros and cons of both. And also, I don't know if I mentioned it, but I have a video on direct assessment as well, link in the description. But that is going to be it for our time today. So next time, we're going to continue our look at assessment and take a look at how do you prioritize target behavior. So say after your assessment, you identify a slew, a plethora of target behaviors that need to be modified in this particular client. How do you decide which ones to begin with and which ones to solve, to wait on for a later time? We'll get to all that when we meet next time. But other than that, until I see you, stay frosty, stay functional, and go modify some behavior. Different facilities, different intervention facilities. One example of them, oh my gosh,